Hey there, YouTube. When last we talked, Kefka and his many villainous virtues were the subject. In part 2 of this character study, this character showdown, we'll pivot to Sephiroth and discuss why he isn't much of a character, at least not compared to Kefka. In part 1, I talked a bit about the power paradox. As a villain grows in power, the likelihood that they are interesting drops. It's not a hard and fast rule, and there are plenty of exceptions, but I think it serves as a general guideline, and at least a worthy springboard for discussion. Put another way, the most powerful villains tend to be the most one-dimensional, the most predictable, and the least relatable. Unfortunately for those of us with FF7 tinted goggles on, Sephiroth falls into this trap. Before we address him in particular though, let's compare, again, Superman and Batman. Yes, we made this comparison in part 1, but it's a useful one because everyone knows Superman and Batman, their abilities, and their adversaries. They are also very different characters, which makes them an excellent example of the power paradox at work. Superman has every tool in the box, every trick in the bag. He can outmuscle, outrun, outthink, and out-heat vision his foes. When Superman shows up, party time's over for the bad guys. And that's what makes him a pretty boring hero. Could you, the reader, ever be held in suspense when Superman confronts a bad guy? There's certainly nothing on Earth that threatens the Man of Steel. The dude who can move planets. When a thug pulls a pistol on Kal-El, it's worth a laugh. I imagine comic artists now use the thug pulling a gun on Superman trope as comedic shorthand. Batman, though. When some street tough has Batman caught in the open with a gun, it's a real problem for Bruce. He can't sit there in stoic rumination while bullets bounce off of him. No, he better be precise with a batarang or his bat grapple. He better have the Batmobile ready to bail him out or a trusty Bat sidekick ready with a Bat sucker punch. Mundane threats are real threats to Batman, even if they are less of a challenge for the Dark Knight than they would be for one of us hapless civilians. And here's the problem for Superman. To give him a real challenge, a villain that builds at least a modicum of suspense, you have to invent one. It has to be an extraterrestrial, supernatural, or mystic force, or a spooky green rock. And sure, those can be cool, but these threats exist at an abstract level for us humans. They're so out of scale with the conflict we're accustomed to that it doesn't provoke an emotional response, like tension or empathy. A battle between a Kryptonian superhumanoid and a rampaging galactic warlord might as well be a battle between two abstract cosmic forces, given the scale of power we're talking about here. Sure, Superman looks like a human, but that's as far as we can relate to, and that's probably why no one has been able to make a good Superman movie. You don't need relatable characters to put together a sweet comic. Premise, action, and style can carry you a long way there. If you want compelling or memorable characters, though, they need to generate an emotional response. The villains we generally find the most interesting are those we love to hate or those we relate to. Emotional responses both. Power, though, doesn't produce an emotional response. It produces awe. Awe, however, is a self-limiting thing. The first time a villain shows off his power, it can leave a lasting impression. The 10th time? Well, not as novel, not as interesting. If you have a character whose only trait is power, well, that's a problem. It took us a while, but now we'll come back to Sephiroth. All of the issues plaguing Superman apply to FF7's ultimate bad guy too. There seems to be no limit to what the dude can do. And he's one-shotting guys that Cloud's dirt napping through. But what else is there to Sephiroth? He starts massively powerful, finds out his boss has been experimenting on him, and decides he wants more power. It's only about power with Sephiroth, and he's so ridiculously OP compared to Cloud and crew that he might as well be one of those abstract cosmic forces. He doesn't provide much commentary, and his backstory is focused on his role as Shinra's top fixer, which just reinforces his competence. He doesn't offer another angle on the character. He doesn't have an interesting weakness, an interesting behavioral tick, even an interesting catchphrase. It's really goddamn hard to keep a villain this flat interesting for an entire game. There's nothing about his motivations that are easy to understand or recognizably human, which stunts his impact. He's just a ball of destruction, but so is an asteroid, and rocks don't usually make good villains. Sephiroth's motivations are murky, and that limits his emotional resonance. It's hard to feel anything for a character when you don't know what they're doing or why they're doing it. In Sephiroth's case, though, his murky motivations are, in part, a result of an overly complex plot. To be clear, and I want to emphasize the hell out of this, FF7 does have some strong story components, and we'll explore those in another video. However, its plot outside of the first act is convoluted, and Sephiroth is the primary victim of this complexity, in that he is undermined as a villain because the plot is too unfocused. According to the story analysis section in the Final Fantasy VII Ultimania Omega, a cement block of a book detailing everything about the game's setting, Sephiroth's relationship with Aeris was changed several times during production. In some versions, the two were siblings, while in others, they were lovers. It's not a good sign for your villain when a detail that important is still up in the air while the game is being produced. It suggests that Sephiroth was conceived first as an all-powerful force and as a character second, and it shows. Imagine how much more impactful Aeris' death scene, Aeris dies by the way, would be if there was a coherent relationship between her and Sephiroth. If we could understand Sephiroth's motivations, his pursuit of power could be an interesting one. But it's tough to understand those motivations because the plot and setting are overly complex. I don't mean overly complex in that you need a big brain to grasp the story. Plenty of people have mapped it out. I mean, the plot involves so many concepts and abstractions that the player can't react to it emotionally. You have to think about what's going on, and by then it's too late to create that suspense, pity, or rage. Here's a brief list of everything you have to parse through to understand who Sephiroth is as a character. And I'm positive I've missed a few. Here's what you need to understand about FF6 to get who Kefka is as a character. There isn't anything singularly complicated about FF7's plot, but because there's a lot to it, you have to refresh your memory every time the story advances. And Sephiroth is normally the one pushing the plot forward, so the player is tasked with figuring out what the hell is going on whenever the principal villain is on the screen. It's hard to build a connection with the villain that way. With FF6, the setting and plot are simple, so they stay out of the way. And because you don't have to waste mental energy on either, Kefka can take center stage without the player having to build one of those link charts you see in detective shows like Always Sunny.
Yeah, look in the mail. Well, this whole box is Pepe Sylvia!
Now, I'm not saying that complex plots are bad for villains or interesting characters. I'm not saying that you need to dumb a story down to keep it compelling. But if you're going to ramp up the learning curve, every single piece of the plot has to make sense on its own, or it will screw everything else up. It's tough to nail down exactly where FF7's narrative goes from tight to overburdened, but it's probably around the time the Genova stuff starts assuming a larger role in the plot. You've been conditioned early on to fight for the planet as a sort of eco-guerrilla warrior, and then you're switching gears and tracking down a super soldier with experimental alien biology in him. It's a head fake, and I think it keeps Sephiroth from latching on early as a villain of import. Given the narrative's premise and early scenes, the Shinra Corporation would have probably been a more engaging adversary. If you're going to pit the player against some unfeeling, overtuned behemoth, sticking with a faceless corp at least complicates the moral picture and allows for more room to produce interesting story beats. There is a character-crushing consequence to FF7's meandering plot and omnipotent villain, and it's not a problem confined to Final Fantasy or video gaming. If you have a villain that's far more powerful than the protagonists, and if you have a plot that's a bit unwieldy, it's extremely tempting to turn your villain into a plot device. Turn them into a Superman-like figure that can just change the playing field in a moment's notice. When a writer decides to build a plot this way, they're putting most of the narrative in one character's hands. It's an all-or-nothing approach. FF7 tries this with Sephiroth, but because he's hindered by the power paradox, he's reduced to this force of nature that can only express itself in the form of destruction. You're traveling the game world, taking out Shinra goons one by one, tackling Genova a few dozen times, and Sephiroth is wallpaper. He's too powerful to be in the same room as the heroes, because then the player would start wondering why old Sephi doesn't just end it quickly for Cloud and company. This goes back to the genius of Kefka and how he's little more than a weasel for nearly half the game. It's his better half too, because as soon as the brutal gesture ascends to godhood, you stop hearing from him. But in the world of balance, Kefka can pop up at any time because he's limited in power, so he's never far away from the player's mind. His presence is felt more often, and he's given additional chances to make an impact. In FF7 though, when Sephiroth is needed, it's generally to act as a plot device. The insane mind control stuff is the most egregious example. It's like some of the stuff he does is just there to remind you who the villain is. Again, it's hard to establish a connection with a villain who is so inconsistent in his presence. My hunch, and it could be completely wrong, is that the only reason Sephiroth endures as a recognizable villain is because he kills Aeris. And that was a brave decision by the devs. Sephiroth is just a tool in this regard though. Interviews with FF7's writers and designers suggest that the entire scene is really dedicated to Aeris. Sure, Sephiroth cements his place in game history by killing off a useful player character, which was pretty unheard of at the time, but he's just the weapon. There are a lot of finely tuned parts of Final Fantasy VII's narrative, parts that I would even consider superior to FF6. But in the contest of villains, it's pitting a fully realized character in Kefka against a soulless mannequin of devastation. It's not a fair fight, and it's one that Kefka takes handily.